Hello, everybody. If we could gather ourselves, hopefully everyone had a good lunch.
We're not running?
The presentation is shifting to a back to physical evidence direction a little bit, and our next two presenters are rare breeds within the Kennedy assassination community, which are bona fide, certified experts and professionals in the scientific field who are taking on the case. Many amateurs, and I don't mean that in any denigrating way, have gone a long way in analyzing evidence and such like that, but we often don't get the same kind of, and I know this from experience, the same kind of cachet in the real world unless there are also professionals who kind of sign on to the same arguments. And in this case, we have two people who are increasingly starting to work together, and their focus is on the headshot. It's going to be first Paul Chambers and then Sherry Gutierrez, who we're all familiar with. Paul is a scientist who works with NASA and naval research, and his focus is on detonation physics, and his expertise is in physics. And he wrote a book, The Physics of the Headshot, or The Headshot, that goes into quite a bit of depth on his own analysis of the Zapruder film and the physics and timing of the shots. And I know he's, even since his book has come out, he's refined it and revised his theory to some extent. And he's going to share with you additional information and additional insights he has about the headshot. So, without further ado, Mr. Chambers.
Thank you. Well, Headshot was the most provocative title I could possibly think of. And Lamar Walton told me that he was reading this on the plane and he was so afraid he took the cover off lest the stewardess see it and get the wrong idea. The people of Prometheus could not improve on this, but they tried hard. I felt I wanted to call it this because the headshot really, I think, is the key to resolving what happened to Kennedy. If you can figure out the physics or science of that, which is my background, you have a handle on the truth, because there's been so many different versions of what happened over the years. The only way I know to get to the bottom of something is to use science. Headshot is not a long book. And the reason is, the truth can almost always be told succinctly. If I want to trick you, fool you, or bamboozle you, then I'm going to write 1,000 pages. Like some fellow I know, Vincent Bugliosi, who is actually the motivation for this book. I got a copy of his book and started reading it, having been always interested in the assassination. And his book is about 2,000 pages long if you take into account the footnotes and everything else he's got. But I'm a lazy guy. I don't want to read 2,000 pages if I don't have to. So I jumped to the section that talked about the science, what is going on, what actually happens when the shot's hit, and so forth. And I found some very interesting things in his book, and I wanted to put them out here for you. One is called, what I call bad science. First is small objects cannot push large objects because they're too small. Now, it's not the size of objects that's necessarily important. It has to do with the momentum of objects. How fast is it moving? So when the asteroid came and wiped out the dinosaurs, it's actually a very small thing compared to the Earth. But nevertheless, it came in with such velocity that it wiped out the biosphere. There's a show on Discovery Channel called Bad Science, or Bad Universe. And Bad Universe did a simulation of this where they had a giant spherical asteroid, a simulant of the asteroid that was huge. It was made out of silicate, very heavy. And they took a pea-sized object to simulate the asteroid, and they sent it down a 3-stage gun, which shoots it out there about 3 kilometers a second. And it hits this thing, and you can see on the high-speed camera, it rocks it backwards. You wouldn't think it possibly a pea-sized thing to move it, but it does. And the whole thing is the velocity is going, that is, the momentum. So Mr. Bugliosi is wrong about that. And the next thing I didn't know was that, I'm going to get this figured out sooner or later, that soft tissue can direct the path of a bullet through high-angle deflections. Now, I did not know this until I read Mr. Google's book. And the other gem in there was it's very hard to push a child in a swing because you have to push it against the full force of gravity. I also did not know that until I read his book. And I know from personal experience I can't lift my daughter up that easily, but I can very easily push her on the swing. And the reason for that is that the tension in the ropes of the swing are actually holding the child and balancing the force of gravity. So the tension in the ropes actually completely counteract the force of gravity, so the child just sits there. So all I have to do is push horizontally. It's very easy to push the child. But I couldn't understand any of this until I read finally on page 488, Vincent Buglesi says, I had avoided taking physics in high school. Then it dawned on me, okay, now I know what's going on here. And it's interesting that I think Tom Hanks has got a miniseries coming out in a couple of years, and he's based it on this book. And Tom Hanks is an interesting guy. He was a math and science guy in high school, and he wanted to go to NASA and be an astronaut, and he ended up doing the movie Apollo 13, which is really fantastic. And now he's following around a guy who avoided taking physics in high school. And I don't know if this is the beginning of the apocalypse or the dumbing down of America or what it is, but not to worry, I sent Mr. Hanks a copy of my book.
And what did he say?
I never heard back from him, but I heard he had a chance to read it. Now I'll tell you about some good science. In 1962-3, during the time of Kennedy's administration, Richard Feynman, who's a very famous Nobel Prize-winning physicist, tried a little experiment at Caltech where he tried teaching the freshman and sophomore classes there some elementary physics, and these were written into books and they became very, very famous, called Feynman's Lectures on Physics. Carl Sagan says that Volume 1 of this is the best book on science ever written for a layman. But in there he tells you the very principles of, the first is momentum conservation. That means that the momentum of the system, that is the mass times velocity of the initial system, we'll call that mv, so your bullet's moving along, has to equal the final momentum of the system. So if the bullet encounters something, it's going to have to move that mass, but the velocity of that mass will depend. If you multiply the mass times the velocity, the momentum will be conserved. I mean, it doesn't change. If no outside forces act, the momentum of the initial system has to be the same as the momentum of the final system. And now, because of the mv, you're taking into account the fact that there's a velocity to the object. It's not just little m versus big M, it's little b and big B are incorporated there too. And I've got some vectors. These are, momentum is usually represented by a vector, which is an arrow, and the arrow, the key to this is to understand the length of the arrow represents the amount of momentum, the magnitude of momentum. But it also, because it's an arrow with a little pointy thing there, it has a direction to it. This is key to understand. Momentum is a vector, which means it has a magnitude and a direction. This is the key to resolving the Kennedy assassination. I'll explain that a little bit. And the correct explanation of the swing is that, again, the tension of the ropes balance the force of gravity, so I'm just have to accelerate the mass. So a little bit of force will actually move the child along because I'm just pushing against MA. I don't have to worry about gravity involved. The other law that's relevant here is called energy conservation. In this case, there are many different kinds of energies. The two that are salient are the kinetic energy, which is given by 1/2 mv squared, square velocity, and the height of the object gives it a potential energy, and that's given by mgh. G is the acceleration of gravity at sea level, which is 32 feet per second per second. H is just the height of the object. I'll talk a little bit about that later, but these are the relevant laws here. Not too bad. It's about, basic algebra and some very simple freshman physics, but this is what you need to understand this. In '63, Feynman said the reason he did these lectures was because physics was part of the modern culture of our time. So that was 50 years ago. So if he was right then, he's really right today, because our world depends on physics constantly. GPS devices, cell phones, cable television, your fiber optic television, computers, everything depends on physics. None of that would work if someone hadn't figured out the right laws of physics. It's all based on quantum mechanics and light propagation and other things. None of that stuff would work. Okay. All right. The first thing I had to look at when I started my book was to look at the Warren Commission. And one of the things that they concluded was that although it wasn't necessarily the findings, they thought the bullet was shot and hit Governor Connolly is very persuasive evidence to indicate the same bullet which penetrated the president's throat also caused Governor Connolly's wounds. However, not everybody agreed with that, because Governor Connolly himself thought they were hit by separate bullets. His wife thought they were hit by separate bullets. There were other issues involved. So some of the commission members didn't quite agree with that theory, but nevertheless, they say, that's okay. We all think that on the basis of the evidence, Oswald acted alone. Well, the sad thing of this, if you look at the film, first of all, Oswald is constrained by 3 shots, because there's only 3 casings found in the school book depository. And if you look at the timing of the Zapruder film, which I think is the best known extant record of the assassination, and you match up the timing of the shots in that film, it's very difficult to get off more than 3 shots in the time frame that's involved. So a 4th shot caused an enormous amount of problem for the commission from a number of perspectives. And when they found that one of the bullets ricocheted hit the street and injured an innocent bystander, James Tague, that meant that one bullet has got to account for 7 wounds. It's got to account for Kennedy's throat wound, his back wound, Connolly's wounds, front, back, wrist wounds, and in the leg. That's a lot of wounds for one bullet. But if the alternative is 2 bullets, and you know there's a final shot that hits Kennedy in the head, that's 4 shots. 4 shots is a big problem. 4 shots means multiple shooters. So this conclusion makes no sense if there's a 4th shot. And yet they're saying, we don't agree with the single bullet theory. Yeah, single bullet theory has got to be true for this to hold true. So what does the commission do? Basically, they publish the Epimenides paradox. The statement below is true, the statement above is false. Anytime you see a logical conundrum or a logical inconsistency, you know you're being fooled, and you're being deliberately fooled by somebody. So the government doesn't lie, it disinforms. This is the hallmark of disinformation. 2 mutually exclusive, mutually contradictory statements. And that's all you have to read in the entire 26 volumes of the Warren Commission to know you're being fooled, and you're being deliberately tricked. That's all you have to read. Vince Bilius says, I'm going to prove to you that you don't know what you're talking about. Everybody raise your hand and tell me if you've read a conspiracy book. And everybody's hand goes up. Says, now, raise your hand if you've read the Warren Commission report. How many people have read the entire Warren Commission report at the bottom? He says, see, you haven't looked at both sides. And I can tell you, no matter how thin you make your pancakes, they always got 2 sides. Well, that's how quick you have to look at the Warren Commission report. All you have to do is look at the conclusions, and you know it's wrong. So let's move on from that. All right, why did the commission fail? Well, its first problem was it had a duality of purpose. The initial purpose was to investigate what happened to President Kennedy. But the underlying reason why people are joining the commission is because they want to prevent World War III. Or the word that America is going to be thought of as a banana republic. The president can be shot out under our nose and we're a banana republic, especially if the investigation turns back to our own government or something terrible like that. So they're trying to save America's reputation. Johnson's twisting people's arm. Warren himself doesn't want to join until Johnson tells them, well, the first nuclear strike's going to kill 40 million people. And he says, well, you know, Mr. President, if that's serious, I'll join. So immediately, right out of the gate, they've got a different reason for joining the commission than fact-finding. So that's wonderful, and Edward Epstein says, if those 2 goals line up, you're in good shape. But if there becomes a conflict between them, one of those goals is going to become dominant. The second problem was there's no diversity of background in the Warren Commission. Everybody's a lawyer. That means everybody's stuck in one paradigm. And the lawyer-really paradigm that operated in this case was 2 things. One, the body is prima facie evidence. That means it supersedes all other evidence. Whatever the body says, that's what happened. I'm going to ignore everything else. I don't care what it is. That's the first paradigm. The second was science doesn't matter. Because A, we don't understand it. But B, the truth is what you can prove to a jury. And if I put a scientist up and he said, my God, there's conservation momentum in this case, don't worry, I'll get another scientist and I'll put him up there and he'll say, no, it's genetic, it's high-speed genetic. The Warren Commission is right. His head recools because of genetic. And those 2 guys will wash each other out in front of the jury. Usually the people who get on the jury are people who are too dumb to figure out how to get off jury duty. So they can't digest that information, so what do? They ignore it. If juries worked getting at the truth, NASA would be using them to design the space shuttle. I guarantee it. But they don't. All right. The next problem they have is they base their model on corrupted data. We'll talk about that in a little bit. And the last problem, even more serious, is they altered the data. Gerald Ford altered the autopsy data from an entrance wound in the back to a wound in the neck. That's the only way to make the single wall theory work. If it hits him in the back, it's coming out his chest. So it's got to hit him in the neck to come out his throat. So he alters the wound, and in 1997, the Assassination Record Review Board caught him on that, and he admitted to it, well, I moved the wound, he says, for clarification. Well, I guarantee you, there are two absolute ways to get the wrong answer. One is base your model on corrupted data or alter the data. You will, every time, get the wrong answer, I promise you. That's the end of the Warren Commission as far as I'm concerned. Now, how does science find the truth? This is the whole bent and the whole reason for my book, is to say, let's cut through this lawyerly clutter and the nonsense that's been out there, and let's look at it scientifically. How would we do that? Well, the first thing that is important to understand is, how does science go bad? When are things going bad? And the worst example possibly is called Piltdown Man. And for many people who aren't familiar with Piltdown Man, this was a major scientific hoax of the 20th century. This fellow, Dawson, Charles Dawson, was an amateur paleontologist. In 1909, he seeded some gravel pit beds with some fake fossils, the most egregious of which was Piltdown Man. He took the skull of a human that was a few hundred years old and the jawbone of an orangutan, and he put them together, and he filed down the jawbone so you couldn't see where they hooked up, and he filed down the teeth, and he stained them. He did a really good job. And he probably had help from this young student named Pierre Teilhard du Chardin, who became very, very famous. And Stephen Gould thinks that Chardin did this as a student prank. And then all of a sudden, people believed it and took it so seriously he couldn't blow the prank. He couldn't laugh at anybody anymore because it was all the newspapers and it had blown up and would destroy his career. So he kept silent for like 70 years about this. But that's another part of the story. This was so convincing that the entire scientific community and anthropological community, largely around the people of Britain, were so happy to get a fossil in Britain that looked of some kind of antiquity compared to, there were great fossils of Neanderthal man in Germany, but the Germans and the French had the good stuff. The English did not. Now we had a great fossil that was even more primitive than anything anybody else had. They were deliriously happy. Plus it fit into their models of human evolution. We think the brain should evolve first and then everything else, the jawbone and the tissue. So they fell for this hook, line, and sinker. When the real fossils came to light in the 20s and 30s by Raymond Dart, like the Tongue Skull, the scientific community dismissed it. Dart's a fraud. He's faked his fossil. They didn't believe Dart, and Dart had the Tongue Skull, which was the real fossil, small-brained, modern dentition. And it wasn't until years later when more and more of these fossils came to light. By the 40s, there were so many of these fossils, it was clear that Piltdown Man was an outlier. And the only way you could make sense of all the data, because all the data is down here, Piltdown Man's up here somewhere, is to just throw that out. It's clear it was an outlier. It wasn't until the 1950s, you look at 40 years to figure this thing out, that they started to do radiocarbon dating and actually examine the original fossils, and they found that he had filed down the stuff and put these complicated stains on. Very sophisticated thing, but it was a total forgery. They did radiocarbon dating. Instead of 100,000 years old or 2 million years old, like people first thought, it was a couple hundred years old. These were not any antiquity. The moral of the story is two things. One is, in science, you go back and apply new methods to old data. That's one way you get to the truth. The second key thing is that you can't ever in science go by eyewitness testimony alone. It doesn't have meaning in science for this reason. Because the greatest scientists of the day looked at Piltdown Man and anointed it and blessed it as a great fossil. This was the fossil of Rosetta Stone that was going to tell us everything we need to know about human evolution. The best scientists of the day fell hook, line, and sinker for it. So if science said, well, we're going to accept that without the evidence, without physical evidence, you never get it out. You never get it fixed. That would still be plaguing us today. But because science demands something more, physical evidence, or a reproducible experiment, you can always go back and redo the experiment or look at the physical evidence and get to the truth. This is very important. All right, the second way science gets at the truth is to fit models to data, not data to models. This is what the Warren Commission did. They fit their data to a model. The model was Oswald shot Kennedy. Every piece of data is going to go into that model, no matter how we have to force it in there. We'll do 10 single bullet theory. It doesn't matter. We'll jump through a million hoops. But by God, Oswald shot Kennedy. This is fitting a data to a model. Wrong answer. Fit models to data. Always go by the data. Fit your model to the data. And the wonderful example of this in the history of science is given by Kepler and Tycho Brahe. Tycho Brahe, I'm belaboring this for a reason. And actually, when I first sent my book out to publishers, they would write back and say, there's too much Tycho Brahe here. I can't publish that. would go on like that. Finally, I found someone who had a more open mind on the issue. But Tycho Brahe was this very famous, rich, wealthy aristocrat. And he had his own island, the island of Sven, and he bought these very sophisticated instruments to measure the heavens. He did the most sophisticated naked eye measurements ever. I don't think they've been rivaled to today. It's like 1500 or something. And it was beautiful, exquisite data. Now this little fellow, Kepler, was a young guy, and he had this interesting model where he looked at the perfect solids of the Greeks, the sphere, the cube, the prisms and things. He took these the perfect rectangular solids, icosahedron, put them together in this model to model the solar system. Because at that time only 5 planets were known, and this was working perfectly. But he couldn't get it to work out really, really well. But he's so impressed, Tycho Brahe, that Brahe invited him to his laboratory to spend. Well, they're a little bit of a tussle. He didn't want to give him his data. On his deathbed, Brahe bequeaths him the data, and he says, "Don't let me have died in vain." That's what he says in death row. Well, Kepler would go on to immortalize Brahe. Kepler takes Brahe's data, and he tries to fit it into a model. The Greek model was these perfect crystalline spheres of everything moving around in the heavens. And he just can't make things work out. The orbit of Mars, he's getting a good agreement, but a couple of these points are way, way off, and he just knows Brahe's data is too good. Brahe can't be wrong. So he pushes himself, and he comes up with the right answer, which is the ellipse. And that's an oval shape with 2 foci. So the planet, actually the sun's at 1 foci, so the sun sort of goes a little bit farther away here and a little closer to the other side. This is the right model. But only because he persisted did he get this model. And Isaac Newton comes along years later, 50 years later, and plugs this into, he invents calculus, which is a huge invention. He plugs in Kepler's elliptical orbits, and by God, the inverse force law falls out. That's what makes the apple fall down and hit the earth. Newton figured out exactly what the law was. It's an inverse squared law. It's proportional to the mass of the object, the gravitational constant, and the inverse distance between the centers of the objects. That's the right law, and he gets it from Kepler, plugging it into his calculus. This is a huge, major turning point in the history of science. Someone who proved something mathematically. It's just the Principia is just a major change that turned everything from doing astrology to doing modern science. And it's because one guy took the time to fit the data to the model. This is the key. Now, one of the things that let Kepler see this key was that in 1603, which is the last supernova in this galaxy, it was so bright you could see it during the daytime. Kepler saw the supernova, and that instant he realized this Greek idea of these beautiful, perfect, immutable heavens with these crystalline spheres was wrong, because the heavens were mutable. The supernova went blinking, it goes for a couple weeks and it goes out. They changed. That led him to the next level that he needed to get to. And the supernova brings up an interesting point. How do you deal with events that you can't control? You can do an experiment in your lab, or you can find a fossil, but there are things you don't control, like supernovas, or earthquakes, or volcanoes. But you still want to study them scientifically. So the way scientists get around that is to use multiple independent instrumented records. So you don't look at it with one telescope, you look at it with several telescopes. If I see a supernova in M31 in Andromeda, I call up my friend at another observatory, and he looks at it. So one supernova, I can say, well, you got a firefly in your mirror, and every time you look, it's pulsing, and it looks like it's a supernova, but really it's just a firefly. Okay, fine, well, I call up the Keck and Orion, and they look at it and say, I see the same thing, the supernova's in M31. Now, if I say the Keck's got a firefly, the mirror might be 100 square meters, you have to have a firefly in exactly the same place in both mirrors. The probability of that is astronomically small. And if I had a third telescope or a fourth telescope, or I look at the gamma ray spectrum or the radio spectrum, because I'm seeing emissions in all the spectrum, it's very, very, very improbable that a glitch is going to happen in the exact same way in each of these different apparatus. This is the trick scientists use to deal with multiple transient events that happen very once or happen over and over again, but for brief periods of time that are uncontrollable. This is the program we need to find out what happened to Kennedy. Multiple independent instrument records. I do a lot of science stuff. I think it's important. All right, first, let's look at what happened in the medical autopsy. Again, the body's private face evidence. It's clear this wound has been altered. The descriptions of the surgeons in Dallas, they only did a thin slice here to do a tracheometry. This looks like somebody went in there and dug around for a bullet. The head's been altered. The first thing the doctors say when he comes off out of the wrapping of the box with surgeon the head, name at the top of the skull. This is written clearly, see the Sanguinier report. Once he says that, that's corrupted data. Once a medical expert says surgery of the head, and no surgery they ever done in Dallas, it's over. That's corrupted data. It's unpublished. If I try to publish corrupted data, not only will that paper get published, the next 10 will get published. Never, ever attempt to publish data that you know has been corrupted. You have to go back and try and reproduce it. That kills it out. But you can now look in comparison to this Bruder film, you just see this little flap, you know, above the guy's ear, and then here you see all this massive carnage, damage to the top of his head and everything else. It's really, really egregious. So the bottom line here, I think, is that Kennedy is America's piltdown man. And this is the autopsy records. This shows, he's got a ruler here, and it looks like this may be lining up where the bullet wound actually comes in. If you look at the holes here, he's clearly getting shot in the back from the official autopsy. There's other corroboration for that, which is that his jacket and his shirt are all damaged in the back. There's no wound in the back of his neck. There's no wound in the back of his head. All this stuff looks like it's been faked up. The official autopsy photos, boy, a whole piece of his skull is missing. I mean, the front of his face is missing. His face would be sunken, his eye socket would be sunken in. Nobody reports this. None of the pictures of Kennedy show this. Nobody at the Dallas hospital shows this. This isn't even his head. This is just egregiously fraudulent. But notice in here that he's got particulates in the front of the head. So whatever went in there drove a bunch of particulates in the front of the head. That has some importance, and I'll explain that in a minute. But none of this has any validity. But the key thing is there's no wound in the back of his head, and the shot hits him in the back. All right, now we're going to look at the single bullet theory. What happens? The bullet comes in his back and it goes by his vertebrae here and it hits his lung. We know it hits his lung. Official autopsy showed contusion to the lung. In addition, the Dallas doctors had trouble maintaining integrity of the respiratory system because when they plugged his trachea, he still was losing air and was on the right side. And they were trying to put a hole in here before he expired. But we know there's damage to the lung from various things. So it comes in, hits his lung. Somehow, in the name of God, it's got to get from his lung to his windpipe. And the only way that's going to happen is if the soft tissue can redeflect the breath from that bullet. This bullet is moving 2,000 feet per second. It's almost twice the speed of sound. Its density is about 11 grams per cc. Bone's about 2 grams per cc. Tissue is 1 gram per cc. You're looking at a very soft tissue deflecting a hardened military round going 2,000 feet per second. It's ridiculous. It's like firing a cannonball on a piece of tissue paper and having it bounce back at you. But this is what this theory requires. And if it even did this, it still doesn't work because it clips his chin and it keeps on going. So even this nonsense does work. I don't know if Boo knows he took geometry, but in my book, 2 points form a line, and that keeps on going out through here. And in fact, the group in Adelaide, Australia, fired a live fire test with 2 dummies. And when I do radio interviews, they keep bringing this up, and I keep telling them it's disinformation, because even though the bullet passed through 2 dummies, they may be lined up horizontally for that to happen, the Kennedy and the Connolly in the car. It's the vertical path of the bullet that makes this ridiculous and impossible. And the first thing you saw in their video was it went right through his back and came out his chest. And you can clearly see it on the video. But guess what? They never show you where it came out. They deliberately don't show you because guess what? It doesn't come out his neck. They don't want to tell you that. So that's disinformation. They're being dishonest because they're withholding a key piece of information. You can see it in the video, but they don't make a point of it. It's a key point. Because they leave that out, they're tricky. It's a discovery channel. Okay, so this model doesn't even work. Now I have to go to a more extreme model. It has to come in, bounce backwards off the lung. Again, it's just your cannonball bounce off the tissue paper. And make it another extreme high angle deflection. There's a good show on television called Deadliest Warrior, and they go around there shooting hundreds of bullets each week at carcasses and anthropomorphic dummies. And not once, ever, I see, I must see 1,000 bullets on that show. Not one time I've ever seen a bullet go into somebody's body and come bouncing back out again. Because that's what this model requires. Anytime you make a deflection greater than 90 degrees, it's bouncing. It's bouncing. Never happens, not in real life. But somehow it has to do that bounce back, then it hits here, it does another bounce back, and it comes back here. So this is just beyond ridiculous. Unless Kennedy's bones are made of depleted uranium, where he's the bionic man, this scenario cannot happen. Got it. All right. The second thing that nails this is human reaction times. Both Connolly and Mrs. Connolly thought that Kennedy and Connolly were hit by separate bullets. What are human reaction times? Well, if you drop something, you have to have a friend. I guess I'll use microphones. have your friend hold a ruler in your hands and drop it, and you pinch your fingers. Now I know I'm dropping it, so I'm going to catch it, but you don't know when he's going to drop it. So that's an example of your reaction times. Your eye sees it drop, and it catches it. And that reaction time is about 8-inch drop, which corresponds to 200 milliseconds, about a fifth of a second. That's your reaction time. But Kennedy now coming out from behind the sign, his arms are clutching his throat. It's not a Thornburg maneuver. A lot of posers say, oh, it's a Thornburg maneuver. You look at the medical illustration, Thornburg maneuver is this. This is a guy clutching his throat. This is Thornburg. So he's clutching his throat because he got hit in the back at that point. He's already well into his reaction. But Connolly is sitting here pristine, unhappy as a clam. He's not doing anything. In fact, in the next frame, I believe his lapel flaps out, and some people with forensic analysis say, oh, this is when he was shot. Well, Kennedy's already shot. He'd shot at least 200 milliseconds before. That bullet's fired in 2,000 feet per second. In 200 milliseconds, it's 400 feet, 300 feet downrange. That bullet's way downrange. It's not going to hit Connolly. So the bottom line is that the distance between Kennedy and Connolly is 3 feet. The bullet's 400 feet downrange. This just, again, rules it out simply from the timing and human reaction time. These are simple experiments you can do at home. Because none of the evidence lines up with a single bullet theory, we can absolutely rule it out. The single bullet theory is an example of another marvelous theory shot down by a brutal gang of facts. All right. So, because of all this nonsense, again, once the single bullet theory fails, you know there's multiple shooters in Dealey Plaza. That's A. That's very important. People write reviews of my book and they say, Chambers has more credentials than Oliver Stone, but his book is not definitive. Well, I'm going to try to prove it today. My book it's beyond definitive. Because every one of these things that I'm showing you is a knockout punch for the government version of that. Every single one. If you have a series of knockout punches, you knock the guy out. All right, this is what the House did because there's so much confusion, and this brutal film aired on national television. There was a lot of interest to open up the study of the assassination, including Martin Luther King and Bobby Kennedy and JFK. And so they actually there was a Dixie Bell recording that came to light, and they looked at the impulses on there, and they sent it to some real experts, people who did sonar analysis for the Navy, Weiss and Atkinson and some other groups. And they concluded, yeah, these are gunshots. And they had a second group corroborate that, another university group, and they authorized live fire tests in Dealey Plaza, where they actually had people firing into sandbags from the grassy knoll and from the school repository, and they lined it up with microphones around the plaza to see what would match up. This is an example of acoustical waveform. There are different peaks in here because you get reverberations and echoes. This is what a waveform looks like. If you did an experiment in a bomb-proof and you look at an explosion and you measure pressure waves, because the acoustic wave has nothing but a series of pressure waves in the air, it looks exactly like this. This is exactly what a pressure wave system looks like. And they were able to match up these waveforms with the live fire tests. And they got some very good agreement, and they got an extraordinary agreement for a shot from the grassy knoll. Well, the House doesn't believe in the shot from the grassy knoll, and I talked to G. Robert Blakely at length about this. He's convinced that the shooter from the grassy knoll fired a shot because it lines up with the data, it's a perfect acoustical match. But he missed. He missed. I've been on the grassy knoll looking down there. Boy, it's a hard shot. I think I could hit it. Hard to miss it. But he's convinced that the guy missed. And because of that, they didn't line their data up properly, and they couldn't get this match. But if you sync that shot up to Z312, you get an extraordinarily good match with the other shots. This shot comes in at 206, 210. That's when Kennedy emerged from the sign. This shot lines up with a girl running along with the motorcade. He interviewed this girl, and she stops. And you can see in this video film when she stops. He said, "Why did you stop?" She says, "I heard a shot. That's why I stopped." So you get an extraordinarily good match with all these data points, and this won't happen by accident. The House knew that the data points matched up if they just synced the grassy knoll shot with the headshot. Said they did something stupid. Again, same dumb mistake. Let's base our model on the corrupted data. How dumb is that, right? The guy said surgery in the head. You know there's no surgery in down. The top of his head is corrupted. Base your model on that, but not, again, we'll do the other thing. We'll move the data. We had a data point, which is somebody drew a picture of a shot in the back of there. Well, that wasn't right. We'll just move that data up there and we'll get something that looks like this, but still doesn't match this brutal film. Same stupid things that the Warren Commission did. But the one good thing they did was this acoustical data, and they concluded that there's an extra shot. There are multiple shots, at least 4 or 5 shots, but one of them's coming from that grass. You know, and they concluded a conspiracy to assassinate Kennedy. Well, What happens to the headshot from behind? Just look at this model. Boo Lewis, he loves this model. He spends chapters and chapters on it. What it requires is the headshot comes in the back of his head and comes out the side of his head. So that means your shot has to make an L-shaped turn from the side of his head. Again, you got soft tissue of brain redirecting a military-hardened bullet traveling 2,000 feet per second. Not going to happen. And then the jetting from this is going to knock his head back. Well, I got bad news for him. Most of the jetting is going up here. That has a very small component of momentum in this direction. And so it won't force it back unless this is ejecting supersonically, in which case you won't see it on 18 frames per second film. You'll see it on a high-speed film if it ejects supersonically, but that's not the case here. So the other way this model works is that shot comes from the other side of Dealey Plaza, and then you got another problem. Oswald can't be teleporting back and forth from Dealey Plaza, so now I've got another problem there. But the bottom line is the shot comes in and comes out the side of the cell, and it just can't happen that way.
Question?
And live fire tests done at Army Research Lab, guys fired, Dr. Olivier fired these shots and they just come out his eye socket every time. Nothing ever looks anything like this. So the other thing I wanted to mention to you was, if you, Boo Lewis says the official autopsy is accurate, so you got fragments in the front of the head. Has a bullet come in here, throw fragments in the front of his head and exit out the side? How does it do that? How does it send fragments that way and exit out the side? Now I could fake this up experimentally by putting a metal plate in his head, and I could redirect the path of the bullet, but then the fragments can't kill it. So if your model is so bad that you can't even fake it experimentally, it's beyond ridiculous. And the other problem, it doesn't agree with experiment. And if your theory doesn't agree with experiment, it's wrong. It doesn't matter who thought it up, how smart they were, how many degrees they have, or how illustrious they are. If your experiment, your theory doesn't agree with experiment, it's wrong. The final fatal shot from behind theory is wrong.
Question? On the previous slide, could you go back? There seems to be a streak coming out of his head at about 80 degrees or so.
Yeah, I'll talk about that.
Do you have any idea what that is?
Yeah, there's probably throwing blood on it. What happens is the bullet's coming in very, very fast. So you've got an incompressible fluid, which is the blood in your head, which is also under systolic pressure. And it's going to spike the pressure up. It's also going to leave you an outlet. So once the pressure spikes, and plus you've got systolic pressure, where's the incompressible fluid going to go? It's going to come back out through the outlet. Again, if you look at the Bad Universe show, when they shoot the asteroid in and hits the Earth, all the particulates ejected come back out. They can't go in, so they come back out. So you get a lot of ejecta coming back out. You see that also in sputtering phenomena and thin film surface science, things like that. But the bottom line is, the blood's an incompressible fluid, and you give it a hole to come back out, and you put it under pressure, it sort of goes flying back out. That's also, this sort of thing is characteristic of a high velocity round. Here's how we can see out what does happen. A bullet comes in, this is called a ballistic pendulum. This is a device for measuring the speed of a bullet. And it consists of a wooden block on a string or a bar or some type of suspension. The bullet comes in with an instant velocity, little v and little m, because they're not very big, maybe little m's and v's. And it lodges inside the block. But when it does that, the block must conserve momentum. So now the block with big M has to recoil with big V in this direction. But it turns out, because the conservation of momentum, you have a small thing moving very, very fast. Now a big thing is going to move very slowly because the MVs have to be equal. This guy is stationary to start with. This guy's moving. This guy lodges inside, and then this guy starts moving. The V must be small to compensate for the fact that it's very massive. And when it goes up here, you can use the little formula I showed you before, the 1/2 mv squared equals mgh formula to back out the velocity of the big V, and then use conservation of momentum, m little v equals m little m plus big V, and you get an example for little v, which gives you the initial velocity of the bullet. And I'm just using a simple principle of physics called conservation of momentum. The bullet lodges in here, and energy is lost to pushing things around and to heat and other kinds of losses. But the momentum must be conserved. And this is what happens to Kennedy. At 3:13, you can see zoom the jetting effect, bullets incident here. Prior to that, Kennedy's head moved slightly forward, okay? I don't believe he was ever shot from behind. I mean, I've looked at this brutal film down at the National Archives over and over, and the driver stopped the car dead in the road just before Kennedy shot. He's looking back at Kennedy. Now, if I'm the driver, I'm hitting the accelerator and getting out of there. He knows Kennedy's under stress. This guy is looking back, bang, slams the brake, stops the car dead. His head explodes, Then he turns around and accelerates again. And so there's a slight forward movement, which I believe is simply due to the deceleration of the limit. Kennedy is listless, and when the limit stops, he just goes forward slightly. It's a very slight movement. But the next frame, 3:14, he's moving backwards immediately. Again, if it's a human reaction forcing that to happen, you can't do that within 50 milliseconds, about 50 milliseconds per frame. It's going to take him a couple hundred milliseconds. But it takes me a couple hundred milliseconds to do that. Try him doing that. It doesn't make any sense. You can't do that instantaneously. So the people who say it's a muscle spasm are, again, fooling you or tricking you, and you can rule that out with simple experiments. But he recalls just like the ballistic pendulum. It's the same thing. He's sitting on a pivot, his body is suspended. Who says, nah, the bullet has to push against the full force of gravity. Wrong! That's the swing problem. The tension in the ropes is supporting the swing. Kennedy's back and neck are supporting his head against gravity. I don't have to worry about that. I'm just going to move him. It's just like being on a pivot on a swing. The bullet comes in and whoosh, and he moves back, just like in the ballistic pendulum. All right, so what bullet could possibly have done this? Now, the two clues are, one is the ejector that you talked about coming out. One, that's a characteristic of high-speed round instruments. The second clue is that Discovery Channel actually did some live fire tests. They used a large caliber weapon, like a 30-30, and the round just punches straight through Kennedy's head. It just punches through. That's not what happened, because Jackie would probably been hit in that case. So they ruled out the shooter from the grass knoll. They said, I just didn't use the right weapon. With the right weapon is the small caliber round, moving very, very fast. And the fastest commercial cartridge you could buy at that time was the 220 Swift. And that moves a 50-grain round about 4,000 feet per second. It's a varminter, but people use it to hunt deer too. It can kill a deer a couple hundred yards. You get spectacular one-shot kills. I talked to a gunsmith, and he said this was a favorite assassination weapon in the 1960s. And you can see why, because if you're going to hit somebody in the head, the bullet will remain in his head, especially if it's a frangible round. This is one of the things Sarah Webb told the House Committee, that because the right side of the head has got damage in it, and the left side appears to be undamaged, it's a frangible. It's just a round designed to come apart on impact. The reticulate layer inside of a copper jacket. That also is consistent with descriptions of the x-rays, not the official x-rays, multiple descriptions of the x-rays by some of the doctors who said the pattern looked like stars at night. That's characteristic of a frangible round, where the metal lead particles are just breaking apart inside his head. And you hit him with that kind of velocity, it's the same thing that happens in the ballistic pendulum. The bullet goes in there and starts pushing things around and heating up and doing all sorts of massive internal damage inside of his head. It's terrible stuff. But momentum must be conserved. So the momentum of the 220 Swift, I worked out to be something like 3.72 kilograms per meter per second, which are units that physicists love to use. It's just a unit of momentum. The momentum of the head recoil, if you look at how fast his head's going back, is about 3.5. So you've got a pretty good agreement there. A little momentum left over to move his back, to throw some fragments. I took into account the big fragment that's thrown out of there. But the bottom line, this gives a very good agreement. It's got enough momentum to do the job. And I think this is giving you pretty much the solution. The second issue I told you earlier, momentum is a vector, which means it not only does it have a magnitude, we got the magnitude to agree well with the 220 Swift, but we have to look at the direction. And if you look at the direction of Kennedy's head recoil, backwards, back and to the left, and trace that back out, that's going to give you the momentum of the incoming bullet. Not only do we have to match the magnitude up, we have to match the direction up. And when you match the direction up, from his coming at a 45-degree ping right there on the picket fence, that's exactly where the House Select Committee concluded the shot was fired from the grassy knoll. Now the odds of that House data matching up, not only did they match, could you match up frame by frame if you do that sync that I told you about, but they also matched up the speed of the motorcade. It went from microphone to microphone, matches the speed of the motorcade. That's very hard to do. At 11 miles per hour. When that happened, they knew they were on the right track. If you get 5 shots to line up in the right order, matching the speed of the motorcade, and in addition to that, you match up all the shots from the Zaberta film, the odds of that happening are astronomically small. And people try to criticize that data, oh, it's not statistically valid. It's nonsense. It's like winning the lottery twice, 2 nights in a row or something. There's the odds of that happening randomly. That data is very, very solid. And then you combine it with this, a completely different technique. That's what I told you about at the beginning. Use multiple independent instrument records to get the answer. So we've got the acoustic records, which are scientifically valid, and the Zaberta film, which I'll discuss in a second, why it's scientifically valid. Film records are commonly used in science, especially in high-speed events, detonation physics events, distortions, impacts. Use a high-speed camera event. These films go millions of frames per second, too fast, you know, to do in any kind of standard way. But the film record is used commonly to make these kinds of analysis. That's what you got here. You have a film record and an acoustic record, and by God, they give you the same answer. There must be 1,000 locations this guy could be shooting in Dealey Plaza. What are the odds that they're both going to give you the exact same answer? The same spot of the left side picking fence and the left side. Astronomically small. That completes the program that we started at the beginning. To find an agreement between multiple independent instrument records, and that's what we've done. This is how to approach this scientifically. It demands a shot from the grassy knoll, more than one shooter. This is beyond definitive. And I actually did some work with Photoshop, and if you throw this Mormon thing in, you get the high resolution versions. It's the big resolution version on Wikipedia. You can actually pull a face out of there. And I had a portrait artist look at this, and she thinks it's a face. And then just for fun, we tried to match up Lucy and Sardi, and there's a match between the nose and the shape of the face. She thinks Sardi could be a good agreement. If you're a Sardi fan, this is significant. But the point is the exact same spot. The face is coming out of the exact same spot that you get from all the other stuff. So Google this, if you can see a face in there, your eyes should be donated to science. I don't think he's looking hard enough. But I don't put this in the book about Sardi or anything, but I show you guys just for fun. That I think this is a real person there. He's at the exact spot that the guy would be. This is moments after the shot was fired. In fact, you can see the head recoil. All right.
Question, how many shots did Sardi fire?
It could have, who knows? He fired at least one from the grassy knoll. He could have fired the shot that hit him in the throat. That's a possibility. So a lot of witnesses heard 2 shots from the grassy knoll, especially people sitting in the car behind, Kenny O'Donnell and those guys. They believe 2 shots. That second shot in the throat, which had to come in the front, could have come from somewhere else in the Dealey Plaza. I mean, you can't sort out everything in here, but you can't sort out their multiple assassins. What's the Bruder film altered? There's a huge cottage community out there right now that says, yeah, it's been altered. Okay, well, David Roden, who's a historian and wrote a book called The Bruder Film, he argues there just wasn't enough time between the times the Bruder puts it in the safe the night before and the next morning when he gets it. You know, you've got 7 hours where you have to get in there, you have to steal it, fly it to California or Washington, make alterations with technology that wasn't available at the time, then you have to bring it all back. You know, I used to work for the government, and I know that the government people can't even make a decision of what to alter in 3 or 4 hours. They have to sit down and debate it for weeks. What are we going to alter here? Nobody can do that. Okay, so that makes no sense that could have happened. Then it got to Life magazine. They're not going to alter it to jeopardize their revenue streams. But you know, a lot of people think that, I guess that means time is up. So the bottom line is, Roland Zavada looked at this and said that it's in-camera original. If you want to advance that theory, you're going to have to fool Zavada, make your own film up, and see if you can fool him. If you can't do that, give up. To the historical record, this is Douglas that said, no, nothing can exist without paternity of history. Hence, the latter is sacred. And I agree with him absolutely, but he's got the completely wrong viewpoint. Our history has been tampered with and distorted, and I think it's a national tragedy. And the fact that our government and our news media are either scientifically illiterate fools or total liars, neither one is which is good. I think I've proved this, and people have read this book and said it's changed their view on the Kennedy assassination. And I hope everyone will at least take a look at it. Well, thank you very much.
I guess maybe what we'll do is combine Sherry and Paul at the end and do question and answer afterwards. Is that?
It doesn't matter.
Oh, unless Sherry wants to start a little bit later. Do you want to answer questions now? Why not?
Questions? Of course, Robert Morrow.
Hey, great presentation. Like you, I'm a believer in the headshot from the grassy knoll. What is your personal opinion on the total number of shots and the sequencing of them based on Zapruder film? I'm just curious.
I think the House saw 5 shots that they can conclude. The Zapruder film, I don't think you can see all the shots on there, but the House committee saw 5 waveforms that they're pretty confident. There could have been as much as 9. But there could have been a lot of shots in Dealey Plaza. I think there's at least 3 shooters shooting at the guy. They could have got all 9, 10 shots easily. So the answer is scientifically it's hard to say, but I think there's at least 4 or 5.
At least 4 or 5, maybe 9 or 10.
Could be that high.
Next.
Did you measure the backward velocity of JFK's head? What was it?
Yeah, I did. It comes out to, it moves like 8.5 inches within the 10 frames or something. So I measured that and I wove it into the velocity, into the momentum. So it gives a very, very good agreement with the 220 switch.
And you look at the Zapruder film and the head goes backwards at a 45-degree angle to the left.
Yes. Back and forth.
Now,
With 45-degree angle with respect to the limousine, that is the axis of the limousine.
right, well, the bullet comes in at 45 degrees, about 45 degrees.
Right.
Okay. His head goes backward like that.
Yep.
Okay. Now, there were about 10 people or so that said that the limousine came to a complete stop.
It does. I mean, I've looked at that Zapruder film a gazillion times. I talked to the guy at the National Archives. I said, could this have been altered? He said, not within the realm of possibility. I've looked at it over and over again. You have to look at the high-speed, full-speed version. That thing stops dead in the road. I mean, it stops. Now, whether it stops for a second or 2 seconds, time slows down. I know this from personal experience. If you're in some very emotional situation, watch this sporting event, time slows down in your mind.
But I looked at the Zapruder film. You can look at it on YouTube.
Go down to the National Archives and look at it. Take their version and look at that, and that thing comes to a stop. And until you've done that, I'm not interested in what you saw on YouTube.
It doesn't stop.
Well, I disagree with you. Go down to the National Archives, take a look. The thing comes to a complete
Gary
stop.
Aguilar has copies from the National Archives.
I'm not interested in a copy. Go down and watch the original film. Go travel to Maryland.
We have done that.
But you're not watching it clearly because it comes to
Measured.
a stop.
It doesn't stop.
Well, what does it do? then?
Slows.
Slows.
Well, it slows very dramatically then,
Yes,
but
it
it looks
slows
like a pretty
dramatically
complete
by
stop
about
there.
30%. Not a stop.
Or we'll debate that issue.
Paul, my name is Jim Spencer. My question is, while I basically support a shot in the grassy knoll, if I look at his posture earlier in the motorcade, I sense he really is bending over at a certain angle, and I still have trouble answering people's, who might argue, could there be a low-angle shot from the Daltex building that could enter the back at the position we know, yet still exit the throat?
Then you would have to have a wound in the back of his neck, but there's no evidence for a wound in the back of his neck.
No. If you
Oh, I see what you're saying. You want to bring in a low-angle shot,
From
and
the down.
that gets to be some really complicated things because it's going down. Remember, he's slowing down at an angle
Right.
going down on that road there. So now you have to get underneath them, and you have to probably come up through the limousine to make that shot work.
I'm just making the point, it doesn't have to be as magic a bullet if you were arguing a low-angle shot
I
from
don't
the
believe
Delta.
it. Hey, magic bullets are fine. Impossible bullets, that's what I don't believe in. When they violate the law of physics, that I don't believe in.
Joey.
Hey, sir, I noticed that you believe that when Kennedy is raising his arm, he's been shot in the upper back, correct? Or was he shot in the throat like many people think?
He's shot in the back very early because Kellerman says he's shot in the back, and here's Kennedy say I've been hit, which would be impossible if he had shot in the throat. If that bullet went through his throat, it would have ruptured his windpipe. He couldn't have said, oh my God, I'm hit. So that is proof too that it's Tim Johnson.
Just one moment. Emerson Stocks, please go to the concierge. You're needed at home. Okay, you need to, we just have an emergency. Two people back. I think it was first.
Is it possible for you to go back to the picture of Kennedy's tracheostomy? Can you do that? I don't know if that's possible. To the trach. Next one, right there. If you look on the picture to the left, right beside the trach, on Kennedy's right side, on your left side, come out to the left. There's a puncture wound right there. No one has ever addressed that. Now this was in the days before you did catheterizations of internal jugular and subclavians. Do you have any idea what that is?
I don't know. I mean, it could be anything. you know, good, like you said, it could be a mole. I don't know that it's definitive.
You know, I've talked to the doctors who did the trach for a long time. And they did nothing to the neck that would result in that area, and nor did they.
You're talking about this bump here and the.
No, I'm not talking about the bump, I'm
Yeah.
talking about that puncture wound right there. And it actually has a halo around it.
Okay.
And you see that a lot with gunshot wounds.
Well, it's clear that somebody was digging around in there, probably to remove the bullet, I guess.
I think it's an interesting thing that not many people have commented on.
A question with the shot from the right as you postulated, would you expect damage to the left side of the head?
It would depend on what kind of round was used. A lot of the high-speed rounds, I think Sherry's going to address this next, a lot of the high-speed rounds will penetrate. But if it's a frangible round, designed to come apart by impact, which is what Cyril Weck told the initial committee, wrote a memo saying, this damage pattern is consistent with the frangible rounds like President of the American Forensic Society or something. This was in 1977, he told them that. They still didn't believe him, versus the other guy said there's some beveling effect, that means the shot came from behind. There's no evidence for beveling anywhere except what some doctor would call it. Sherry's going to talk about that next, by the way, so you can drill her away.
One more question from me, Tim Nicholson from Anaheim. Do you have any theories on how a small bullet fragment got into Connolly's thigh, or any other theories about what caused his radius bone fracture and fracture of the two ribs in his right side of his chest?
When the Adelaide test, they set up a mock dummies of each of these things, so they made up a mock dummy of the wrist. The bullet went through the Kennedy dummy and starts to tumble. It tumbles into the Connolly, it shatters two ribs because it's tumbling at that point. But it fails to penetrate the wrist. So they did a wrist mock-up with bone and ballistic gel. It bounces off. So it's lost so much energy going through Kennedy. And this is the test that the Warren Commission refused to do. Warren Inspector wouldn't let them do that test. He said, shoot independent, the shooting goats or something. Don't shoot two together. Shoot them independently and make an extrapolation. I'm going to fool you. I'm going to trick you. They did the test, and it bounces off. And instead of saying that, by God, we didn't match it up, they said, well, the bullet's tumbling, so that would... But you know what happens when it goes through Kennedy? It's going to start to tumble, right? And that's their whole point, is when it's tumbling, it comes in and creates this wound on his back, because it looks like a tumbling wound. So they've got all that going, and then they fall out at the end and try to make up some nonsense. Yeah, you got the tumbling, yeah, you damaged multiple ribs, but you couldn't go to the throat. So that's proof that it had to be a shot that hits him directly, otherwise it doesn't have enough energy to do that. If it goes through Kennedy first, it doesn't have the energy to do the rest of the wound.
So where does it come from?
Well, it's a second shot. It hits him independently. He's not hit by the same bullet Kennedy's hit by.
Yeah, but where was the gunman?
Good question. There are some doctors who have made measurements and think the gunman was actually on the right side of the school book depository, not in the sniper's nest, but on the other side. And one thing that's interesting is I think he leaves the gun at the stairwell, so he would have had to carry that gun all the way up there, but someone firing from that location could just move the gun back there. It would be a lot easier and less visible.
And what frame did that happen at?
I think, you know, again, the issue is he believes he's hit around 230, 232, and that's a really good matchup with his acoustic data, by the way. That's when the Connollys think he's hit. And he reacts about 235, 237. Guess what? That's the 200 millisecond reaction time. That comes in pretty good, too. Anything else we've got with this skewer?
Okay, folks, that's...
Thank you. For listening.
We have a bunch of newcomers today. Just the protocol that we're trying to do here. Save your questions.